Hello, I'm Jared Taylor with American Renaissance. These videos aren't being promoted in the usual way, so if you like what you see, please send links to a few friends. How many of you are old enough to remember Idi Amin of Uganda? He took power in a military coup in 1971, but was chased out of the country 8 years later in 1979. He slaughtered political and tribal enemies, and he said he ate their flesh, although he complained that people taste too salty. He liked to be carried around on the shoulders of white people, all 258 pounds of him, and he loved to make white people pledge allegiance to him. Idi Amin married at least 6 women. His favorite wife was a 19-year-old former go-go dancer named Sarah. And depending on which sources you read, he had anywhere from 32 to 54 children. But today, I'd like to talk about how he treated the Indians who were living in Uganda. There were about 80,000 of them in 1972. They were about 1% of the population, but the BBC estimates they owned 90% of the businesses and paid 90% of the entire country's taxes. Amin decided they were parasites, and he kicked them out. Here are a few of them after they landed in Britain. Amin handed out the businesses to his pals, but it just didn't work out very well. The economy shrank to less than half of what it was before. Idi Amin got the boot himself in 1979, and power changed hands 4 times in a brisk African sort of way until Yoweri Museveni took over in 1986. 36 years and 5 terms as president later, Mr. Museveni is still in charge. One of the first things he did, though, was plead for the Indians to come back. And they did. They're again about 1% of the population, and guess how much of the country's taxes they pay? 65%. Isn't it remarkable how such a small number of people and a racial minority can make such a huge difference? Does that remind you of any other country? Maybe Zimbabwe? Whites were never more than about 8% of the population when the country was called Rhodesia. This is the capital when it was still known as Salisbury. Here's a street view of Salisbury, and here is another. This is ladies' night at a Salisbury nightclub. And here is the headmistress and school prefects of Evelyn High School in Bulawayo in 1961. This is the cover of the tourist magazine Rhodesia Calls, December 1976. And meet Miss Rhodesia 1965, when there still was a Miss Rhodesia. It is true, Rhodesia was segregated, and blacks had essentially no role in government, but they had a higher standard of living than blacks in any black-run country. In 1980, international pressure forced white Rhodesians to turn the country over to the black revolutionary Robert Mugabe. In 2000, Mugabe started taking commercial farms from white owners and passing them around to his pals. In just 3 years, wheat production fell by more than 90%, corn by 60%, and tobacco, the #1 export earner, by 75%. Zimbabwe got the world's worst inflation ever. In mid-November 2008, inflation was about 80 billion% per month. Billion with a B. Here is a $100 trillion bill. That's trillion with a T. By that time, per capita GNP was only 1/3 what it had been. Not surprisingly, 90% of the whites left the country, down from nearly 300,000 to 29,000. In 2017, Robert Mugabe was kicked out in a coup after 30 years in power. The new guy, Emmerson Mnangagwa, says he wants whites to come back, and a few have come back to farms that look like this. We'll see how long they stay. Well, Madagascar has a population of 26 million. Not 1 in 1,000 of them is an Indian from India, but they play a huge role in the economy. The richest man in the country is Ilyas Akbarali, worth almost $1 billion. His grandfather came from India. If you look up the 10 richest men in Madagascar, most of them look like this guy, or like this guy, rather than like the people of Madagascar who look like this. In the Ivory Coast in West Africa, Only 0.5% of the population is of Lebanese descent, but they control 50% of the industrial sector, all the shopping malls, and 75 to 80% of the import-export trade. Africa isn't the only place where small numbers of people make a huge economic difference. Overseas Chinese dominate the economies of Southeast Asia in what is called the Bamboo Network. In all of Southeast Asia, Chinese are less than 10% of the population, but they control an estimated 2/3 of the retail trade and own 80% of the publicly traded companies. Local people in Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, they're just bit players. 86% of Southeast Asia's billionaires are Chinese, and most of the rest are Indians, like the ones in Uganda. Amy Chua has written a whole book about the way small minorities can dominate economies if the locals let them, and how much resentment this can cause. You get big differences in wealth in the United States, too. Jews, as they do just about everywhere else, make the most money. In 2016, modern Orthodox Jews had a median household income of $158,000. Who comes next? As you can see from this Wikipedia table, Indian Americans are in second place with over 110,000. Then East Asians with 85,000, whites at 67,800, Hispanics close to 47,000, and 30,500 for blacks. These are huge differences. The median Indian family makes 3 times as much money as the median black family. And out of 96 different groups, who makes the least money? Somali Americans, with a median household income of $24,000. Now, I'm warning you, if you see any patterns here, close your eyes. You should certainly not notice that just about any outsiders who move to Africa do better than the Africans. And you should not notice that in America, African Americans have the lowest incomes. And you must not notice that East Asians, who control the economies of Southeast Asia, also make a lot of money in the United States. And put entirely out of your mind the fact that the country in the Western Hemisphere, which is also the blackest and has been run by blacks since 1804, is also the poorest. Haiti has only 1/3 the GNP per capita of the next poorest country in the hemisphere, which is Nicaragua. Let us not forget, this is YouTube. I have told you nothing but random, unrelated facts. Thomas Jefferson explained it all to us 244 years ago. All men are created equal. Don't forget that. And don't ever forget that we are a nation of immigrants and diversity is our strength. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, take a look at our podcast channel on YouTube. That's Amran Podcasts. Also, please visit our website at amren.com, amren.com.